Welcome back to the Design Principles Podcast. I'm Ben from Bear Architecture, here today with Sam from Arete Architects and Gerard from Gerard Dombrowski Workshop. And today on the show we have a very special guest, Charlotte Warren, friend of the pod. So welcome, Char. So Charlotte is a landscape architect from Wellington, currently working at Studio Pacific Architecture. And we thought we'd just bring her on the show to have a chat about landscape and how it could integrate it a little bit better with our current architecture practices. Charlotte, why don't you give us a bit of an introduction and a rundown on who you are and what you're about, how you got into landscape architecture.
Okay. Hi, my name's Charlotte. To start off with, I'm a landscape architect, and just a quick rundown of exactly what landscape architecture is. It is the design of outdoor environments, from the smallest courtyard or back garden through to citywide master plans. It involves the complex integration of cultural, social, and environmental factors, and relies on collaboration with a whole raft of people, but specifically mana whenua architects, engineering professions, ecologists, and planners. How I sort of found myself in this space, I don't think I can kind of come to work and sort of think about land in such a capacity without my kind of upbringing as a rural kid. So I grew up in the Wairarapa on a farm, and I think that has a huge bearing on how I came to be a landscape architect. I fundamentally have always loved being outside, and I've managed to find a profession that if I'm not outside, I'm imagining outdoor spaces always. So it's pretty critical. And yeah, I guess that's something that you and I, Ben, have in common, that kind of growing up on the land and perpetually kind of thinking about it a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think about it all the time, mainly around how I can use that land to ride my dirt bike or, your paddock car or get up to trouble, and how much more freedom you have growing up on a farm.
True. I'm pretty terrible with machinery, so motorbikes were never my forte. But maybe potentially why I've come to be an urban dweller now is because me and vehicles don't really mix. But no. But yeah. And so just quickly on kind of my background to date, I studied down at Lincoln following the Christchurch earthquakes, which was a very incredible time to move to a new city as a fresh-faced 18-year-old and meet people and study with people and lecturers who are all kind of reeling from the loss of their city. And that really made me understand the connection that people have to place and to their city. And that's kind of stuck with me and is kind of a cornerstone of my practice, is really thinking about that connection to place and fostering that. And I'm very fortunate to have studied at that time in that city where the course was just largely tailored around, landscape as memorial and how does a city rebuild. It was really formative.
Yeah, that's crazy. So were you enrolled to study down there prior to the earthquakes? At some point, did you have kind of second guess your commitment to going and studying down there, or?
Yeah, well, you can either sort of study in one of the three cities here in New Zealand. Either, for me, growing up in the Wairarapa, Wellington was much too close.
Yeah.
And Auckland, as a farm kid, was just a little bit much, and so Christchurch felt like a good balance. But yeah, so the second earthquake happened in September, and I had to make that decision of, do I still go? And I decided to go, and I don't regret it for a minute. It was a fantastic university scene in lots of ways. There was no town, so it was very kind of a lot of flat parties and a lot of fun, and a lot of kind of long-standing friendships were formed through that time. So, and then from a studying point of view, all the course was tailored around earthquake recovery, which was an amazing pivot.
Awesome.
But yeah, from there, I've since worked in Auckland, London, and now Wellington. So I've moved around a bit, and I think that's kind of given me a good perspective of different ways in which people approach practice, and obviously different density. And yeah, particularly seeing what's happening over in the UK really makes you think about what we should be doing here in little New Zealand.
This might be jumping in a bit quick, Charlotte, but it'd be really interesting to know how much of that study or that time studying in Christchurch post-earthquake is now reflected in your work around maybe resilience or other sort of disaster recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I've not been kind of lucky, well, lucky is a sort of difficult word, but I mean, obviously what's happening in New Zealand right now, we see, the effects of climate change and landscapes needing to respond to that, and how you kind of create safe spaces and spaces that deal with the kind of forces of nature, be it massive flood events or earthquakes is obviously a little bit difficult to plan for, but the events up in Auckland, the flooding over the anniversary, and the work that landscape architects have done to kind of future-proof some of those more dense urban environments is pretty amazing, and continues to be critical as we increase the density of our cities.
Nice.
Yeah, that whole concept of densification, I guess, is pretty hectic, and I can imagine it would have been like a complete contrast, your work in England as well, as opposed to little old Wellington. What were some of the learnings, I guess, from working over there or working abroad and travelling that you brought back to Wellington?
Well, I think the thing about London as a city is it's a masterclass in that medium density scale. There's a lot of fantastic terrace housing. There's a lot of great apartments, be it kind of 4-story up to what I think less a fan of is the 30-story stuff. But it's a city that kind of knows, it knows how to do density and it plans for it. It's got great park provisions, great public transport, good streets, and that is entirely by design. That is good planning policy, and that's a city valuing civic space. And so I guess when you kind of think about how they live over there and trying to bring that back to New Zealand, it's difficult. I'm not advocating for a sort of copy-paste scenario, but there are really good learnings about how we as a society can sort of start to feel more comfortable living at higher density.
Are there any key sort of decisions that they've made that you sort of look at as being ones that really bring it together?
Yeah.
How is the city so livable, and specifically by design, I guess?
From a landscape perspective, a huge part of my role was the Greater London Authority had this place space calculator, which essentially you plugged in how many units the development was going to have, be it 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, whether that was open market or whether it was social housing. And that gave, based off, previous developments, like an anticipated number of children who would be living on that site and at what age. And that gave you an area of play space that you should be accounting for in your development.
That's so interesting, that collection, or that, I guess they've got a lot of data to draw from, but I can imagine that would be such a powerful design tool to work with. We should definitely need to up our game in that realm, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So how does that sort of play out on each sort of project scale? Like if you're subdividing a section or something in New Zealand and you're putting 8 units on, would you then have to be required to have a little bit of shared public play space? How does that sort of work?
Yeah, I mean, 8 units is probably of a slightly smaller scale than when this calculator would come into play. But when you're sort of looking at sort of 30 units, that would be when and honestly, I can't quite recall the threshold, but I guess it's just something philosophically for us to kind of think about. If you were to prioritize that, just the consideration of children living in these urban environments, I don't feel like here in New Zealand we quite allow for that. I think the psychology is very much that you live in medium density either prior to having children or when children have left home. And then, that period in the middle, you very much need your backyard.
Yeah.
I guess there's a discussion there of I guess modernism was an example of architects trying to work with landscape in a very utopian sort of way. Let's make the buildings tall and give everyone a shitload of green space, and then a lot of those turn to shit, I guess. And we're urbanly probably not super safe places for people to hang out in. Is there like a structured response to that style, like Robin Hood Gardens, whilst beautiful architecture, maybe less favourable public space?
Yeah, I think those kind of lands, the tower and the park concepts of urbanism were quite often inherently in quite badly situated sites. And what was actually offered on the ground was often, fairly minimal. You essentially had a huge tower and not much else, and then I'd argue not much connection to that space.
Yeah,
so
really not much to work with.
I'd say it was a failure of the architect to engage a landscape architect in modernism that potentially into its demise.
That's a good question then, Charlotte. I mean, so often, and you asked us before we started on the recording, like how many of us have actually worked with a landscape architect before, and I personally haven't, and Gerard said that he has, but not in any sort of continuous or meaningful way. I mean, it sounds like we should be engaging with landscape architects from the initial stages of a project. I mean, there's a chance, I guess, for you to advocate for yourselves here, but do you want to just sort of outline why the importance of landscape architects in integrating a building into the sort of society, well, the built environment, rather than it just being like an isolated structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I think as landscape architects, we're trained to think about space in a systems way, be it ecological systems or social systems, connectivity, ways of living, those sorts of things, those concepts of how land is used are quite fundamental to the way in which we think about design. And so even just to think about it on a residential scale, in the kind of conversations that you have with your clients about what type of meals they have as a family. Are they people who are big entertainers, or is mealtime not a particularly significant thing? And that's how you start to kind of shape the design of the kitchen there. It's the same thinking of how you ultimately want to behave on your land. Is that, do you want to be creating a scenario where the idea of tuis visiting you at home and thinking through, okay, well, I want to be sitting in my back garden and I want to be able to hear the sound of a tui, which is, I think, the ultimate dream for any New Zealander who's fortunate enough to have a back garden. But you sort of start to think about those concepts and build out a design based on that, in terms of species, in terms of spaces, be it for social or more contemplative, obviously production, all those sorts of things. I think the integration with the site and with the broader context is really critical. But it's that whole piece, isn't it? It's designing spaces in the same way that architects do, to live the life you ultimately want to live, and creating that through the lands. The thing that I think that our real strength as landscape architects, in and amongst other things, is the levels piece. I think as landscape architects, compared to architects, levels is something we really understand and really try and work with and utilize. I mean, my life for the past year has been ramps and stairs and integration with levels and all those sorts of things. So I've been busy with the detailed design project. But I think that's our real strength, is that systems thinking and that integration.
Yeah.
You put that really beautifully, and it's interesting. I'm sitting here in Lake Hawea looking out my window, and the landscape surrounding this township it's breathtaking. It's absolutely stunning. But the township itself, particularly the new development areas that I'm looking at here, is stark and almost apocalyptic. And it's so clear that landscape's not been taken into account on any site really whatsoever. And it's a shame, really. And I mean, I'm really coming at this from a residential perspective, but there's so much scope for better engagement with the environment around, and it seems like it's almost a necessity that landscape architects are engaged to sort of help better particularly these suburban developments.
Yeah, this is something I kind of find interesting. Throughout history, when you purchase a property and you intend to build a typical residential house, that really only involves the design and construction of the actual building itself. never includes a landscape designer of any description, or very rarely, which is quite interesting in its own right, though, because basically what that means is you have your bit of land and your house is kind of plonked on it. And then over like, I don't know, a year or two, it's up to the owners or the occupants to craft that landscape or sculpture that landscape in a way that they want to, I guess. So there's still something quite nice about that. I guess it's quite a nice thought. However, as our cities kind of densify, even in places like Hawea, especially with like the medium density realm, you actually have to design the landscaping within that project. So it's meant to be like a little mini replica, I guess they say, of what we use, a quarter acre style living. But the developers kind of already contracted a landscape architect and tried to, I don't know if it's just to dress up the building, or if it's, well, I guess it is a necessity for resource consent, but it's just interesting that now we are required to do some sort of design, although it's terrible, compared to standalone residential where you don't have that requirement at all, and it kind of just grows naturally. What are your thoughts on that kind of natural manner of landscaping versus the more planned landscaping, Shah?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on the person, doesn't it? Or if you take just a purely standard 500 square meter section, the 200 square meter house goes on it, and then there's essentially 300 square meters left. So the way of thinking of it is it's like half of the site has been considered in some ways, and what do you do with the rest? And yeah, I think that in so many ways, the kind of integration with architects and landscape architects, it's such a happy marriage. You know, we have quite often very similar training, but architects, residential architects in particular, there's just, it feels like there is a real opportunity to start to integrate landscape architecture into a residential context. And there's lots of landscape architects doing it, and there's lots of landscape designers doing it. But I think it's a society valuing that and what you can ultimately get out of that, because it's kind of like a utilization of half of what you've got, which from a farming perspective would be a poor utilization of land in some ways. But anyway. But that's kind of one thing, you know, you can get so much out of outdoor environments. I think if you sort of think about your happiest memories, it's often when you're outside. And, you know, you can really create that with your own space. And as designers, we're spatial in the way we think, but actually a lot of society isn't. And there is real value of integrating a landscape architect into your work, because you'll find that the outcome isn't what you would have imagined otherwise. I think the question about kind of medium density environments, that's when things, in particular in New Zealand, are getting really thorny. You know, you go and you walk up Mount Iron and you look at what's happening in Wanaka in terms of the spread of sort of those, you know, single detached homes at an alarming rate, spreading out into what is an incredibly beautiful landscape. You know, you have to question at what point when sites, you know, when they get smaller and smaller, at what point would you be happier in an apartment where you could look at the mountains rather than look into a Pinus radiata 1.8 meter fence that's, you know, 3 meters from your living room window? I mean, it's a pretty interesting time in residential design in New Zealand, and particularly, I think, down south and in and around those lakes.
Yeah, the shrinking lot size is a big concern. I mean, you're talking about lot sizes up to 200 square meters with a 150 square meter house on them in some instances, and it's all they have is that 4 meter circle of outdoor space, and that's it, really.
But would you prefer that, Sam?
Nice environments.
But would you prefer that, or would you prefer everyone to just go out and have their own quarter acre section? Like, would you prefer spread, or would you prefer densification? That's the thing. Surely densification is a better answer.
I think so.
You can't take a city from apartment block to paddock.
No, I 100% agree, and
there's always going to be a blurring.
There has to be a blurring. You know, the mountain has to crumble, right? So there's always going to be that built-up area in the centre of whatever place it be it a city, be it a township, around all the facilities and infrastructure and the amenities, and then it's going to always fine grain out. But I don't disagree, Ben, that I think, and Charlotte, that the sprawl is the issue. The issue here is that there is no peak. It's essentially a very small mound and then a very, 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 very long sort of decline down to farmland.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's like a bit of an error in making houses as slightly smaller than your section, which is pretty horrible. We all love a pine fence. But I think as well for like the age of the city, like you get those older suburbs that have trees and like a mix of housing, whereas a lot of these suburbs are never going to have a mix. It's just going to be spec city. Like at least with the older plot layouts, they were quite deep. It actually allows for that subdivision over time. So maybe in those outer zones, you have larger section sizes that one day if there's another micro city or another transport node out there that requires densification, then it's less jarring of a bowling the whole city. I think there's that discussion though around tying landscape architects more into the architecture process is pretty epic, and it's definitely something I've started to notice within my practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just because the connection to earth with your building is so integral to like the outcome of your architecture. Quite often it gets taken out because it's cost cutting or value engineering. The client gets to the end of the job and they've got no money, which is the realities of it sometimes. But to have a plan in place is pretty epic.
And a good example of that is the one you're working on for your mum at the moment, isn't it? Where you've basically built the house around a courtyard style, which, I mean, courtyard architecture is definitely a fad at the moment.
Yeah, the house is, we've called the house the secret garden house just because mum talked about the secret garden story as a kid. So we always had this kind of romantic notion of a fence, and then through the fence is this magical other world.
Pine fence?
Yeah, love those pine fence. Corrugate, so I guess.
Nice.
Toit.
So you don't see it from the outside. It looks like a building from the outside, and you come inside and it's a
secret garden.
Hopefully a magical courtyard.
But
which we started planting fairly early on to.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Established by the time you get to the end of the job.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, you've taken a really interesting and pragmatic approach in that you've sort of semi-finished the building and then now planting to let it build up. So at the completion, it's like well established. I mean, Charlotte, how often do you get that opportunity to integrate landscape into the architecture during the construction process, or is it so often not necessarily an afterthought, but certainly a post sort of building construction approach or thought?
I mean, in my case, when I'm working on larger civic realm projects, it's very much at the forefront. It's not kind of considered this phase of work that happens after architecture. It's very much an integrated thing. But I mean, it depends. I mean, in the residential context, what happens a lot these days is that in a streetscape and open space context, the council requires the developer to build those elements first so that the plants are established at the point where people move in. So that is quite often what happens. But I mean, I guess it entirely depends on the client and what they prioritize. If architecture is kind of, and I think maybe that's something that architects could potentially look to develop in that residential context is thinking of the two in tandem. And bringing an landscape architect in at their concept stage. And that's not to say that they'd be engaged throughout the project, certainly not, but that they can start to, you can work together and influence the outcome to create something that's richer than thinking of the two as two independent pieces. Because it is so interlinked, that indoor and outdoor space. If you get that right, both at any scale, then the project is so much better for it.
Just out of curiosity, do you see much value engineering in landscape architecture? Kind of like for general architecture or a house or something. You may design something, but then over time it gets refined down to its essence, so to speak. Is that like a similar thing in landscape?
Yes, landscape architecture certainly isn't immune to value engineering, unfortunately. It's an ongoing. It is as prevalent in our industry as it is in yours. Obviously, that's you start. If you're thinking just that same things. It's finish of walls, surfaces, all those sorts of things. Quality of fixed furniture, plants. Both species selection and grade, the size of plants, depth of topsoil, nothing is immune. It's all considered in that value engineering exercise.
Just interesting because it exists. It certainly exists. I guess this is debatable, but more in the public realm, potentially more in the public realm than, I guess that's not true. Architecture's in the same context is extremely public as well. But I guess creates the in-between spaces, which is used a lot every day. So I wouldn't have thought they'd be skimping on resilience and material quality and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of it's the difference of material. It might be moving from a natural stone finish to an exposed aggregate finish, or reducing the amount of hardscape and increasing the amount of softscape, which in and of itself is, that's something as landscape architects are always trying to get that balance just right, providing enough hardscape, paved areas, sealed areas to allow whatever social functions you need in terms of both movement and dwelling, but then having as much softscape as you possibly can to, obviously from an environmental point of view, with planting and regeneration and trying to improve the ecological quality of that area, and then also mitigation of stormwater. That's a huge piece of landscape architecture, and in the coming years and in coming projects. Even now, you're seeing it, particularly or anywhere really, the necessity for stormwater to be considered in the design.
Yeah. I'd be really interested, Charlotte, to sort of feed a delve a little bit deeper. You just touched on it a little bit, I guess, in terms of your balance between softscape and hardscape. I'd be really interested to get a little bit more of an insight into sort of your design process and how you come up with those judgment calls and material selections and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm just trying to think of a good example to talk through it, but essentially, yeah, it's always difficult because if obviously through the winter months, having too much softscape, i.e. too much lawn or planting, can kind of, if it's a civic realm project in particular, kind of limit the usability of that space through the wetter months. So that kind of encourages more hardscape, but then conversely, that has a higher carbon footprint in terms of, the build-up and all those sorts of things, and then also limits usability in the summer months. So it's a hard one to kind of, it's very site specific, and the levels conversation always works into it if you're working with like a flat site or a hilly site. But essentially, I'm always advocating for as much softscape as we possibly can, just from trying to lower the carbon footprint as much as possible. And I think ultimately hardscape is the default material, and often it doesn't need to be. I think particularly when you head over to Europe, even spaces which are much more used here in New Zealand, people are very content with gravel and hogging, whereas here we love exposed aggregate. It's a default surface always.
And how often are you sort of taking into existing site conditions and or like the history of the site when you're considering those areas as well?
Yeah, always. It's very critical. And civic realm projects, the engagement, the sort of co-design process with mana whenua is critically important. And that's something as landscape architects we've really built our capacity in recent years in particular. And so when you attend the Institute's awards evening, it's mana whenua who are up there taking those awards, and rightly so. They're integral to the design process, and they really shape and enrich a project. And so it's a very important piece of work. But then obviously there's other histories to consider there in terms of European history as well. So that is a layer. But yeah, that site assessment from that cultural lens is really significant. And then obviously the ecological lens as well. What ecology was there, and trying your utmost to try and recreate that, sort of providing habitat for birds, choosing your plant selection. If you get that right, you've got your turi in your back garden, and that's so special. So it's critical.
It's interesting, you've seen those sort of examples of reclaimed cities where the landscape sort of, the city's being left derelict for whatever reason, be it post-nuclear fallout or something along those lines, and nature sort of reclaimed the city and it's been left to grow organically. It must be quite hard to strike that balance between fabricating spaces and letting it grow organically. It'd be interesting to get your take on how you sort of balance that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in sort of urban environments, that's a particular struggle, because you're also trying to balance, safety concerns and facilitating passive surveillance after dark, and preserving sightlines through space. So that often governs, creating a lower story, which is kind of below 1200, and then having clear stem trees, which is kind of, the canopy starts at 2 meters high, to create safe outdoor space. And I mean, that's a critical part of landscape design, and a huge piece of my work, is particularly as a female landscape architect, is, the equality in space after dark really governs design decisions. So it's a really big battle that is getting that right. But ultimately, there's a lot you can do in regenerative planting, in terms of improving ecological value and bringing species back. We know a lot about what birds, how much area birds need in order to be in, to habitat in that zone, and we can work pretty hard and go a long way to kind of creating those spaces for them.
It's amazing. I've never really thought about that, like two-tiered planting and keeping those clear lines of sights. I mean, I guess it's a realm I've not worked in before, and yeah, it's just fascinating to hear that, to that level of detail, even the planting and separation and openness is considered. That's cool.
Yeah, I've always thought basically exactly what you're talking about. I'm not sure where you're getting this information from about the plants and the species and the bird life and that sort of thing. But I've always thought it would be awesome to have like a map of your region that shows what plants work best growing in what areas and what percentage currently exists there, and I guess like a bit of more data around what could be planted to improve the environment within that region, and basically what you're talking about with bringing bird life back, and especially like bees and that sort of thing. So it's really cool to hear you talk about that sort of thing, and I'd love to know where you're getting that information from, because I've tried to look before and it must be pretty deep in there.
No, yeah, Greater Wellington Regional Council has it's like 12 character zones within the kind of wider Wellington region, which encompasses the wider upper as well, and the kind of remnant plants that would have been there and that are now there, and gives you an incredible list of really good plants to use that are kind of local to that area. But yeah, to your point about that, Studio Pacific actually prior to my time produced the Green Network Plan for Wellington City Council.
Oh, awesome.
And that sort of talks about, how big of role actually the private space has to play in, people planting the correct things in their back garden, and what that can do for increasing both canopy coverage and bird life in our cities. So there is a lot we can do within the residential design space to increase both the ecological value of our cities and the bird life in our cities.
I'll put a link to that in our show notes. Sorry, just quickly. Yeah, I'll put a link to that in our show notes, because you're right, Charlotte. It's a pretty incredible little document.
Yeah,
it's open source, but lots of people don't know where to find it. Cool. Sorry, Gerard. Go for it, mate.
The species chat I find quite a key one. I kind of wish all the architecture kids at uni had to do at least one landscape paper, just to kind of give like a little bit of base understanding. I think it would go a long way to helping all this. But around the species stuff, sometimes I get a little frustrated that like some developments only do native plants or something. So I'm a big blossom fan, love a blossom. So in Mum's house we've got absolutely chaos, everything. Lots of colour, lots of things going on. As well as natives, we've got Kawhai, or we've got a mini rata or something. But like around species chat, do you want to give us a little rundown on what's your go-to and what are some bangers that we can pull out for our projects?
Don't say agapanthus.
Do not say
That might get a bit wound up.
I heard your comment about agapanthus. Agapanthus are officially a weed in this country. They're a really big problem.
What about gorse?
Yeah, eradicate.
Yeah. They're one of those plants that was kind of brought in and was very popular, and now they're a big problem. But their root system makes them very cumbersome to get rid of. So they're on my hit list. I'm not an agapantha fan, even when they're in full bloom. I don't understand their sort of aesthetic value.
I've found a partner in crime, team anti-agapanthus.
I stand in solidarity.
Brilliant.
But yes, to your point, Gerard, that's the Griselinea littoralis, which we sort of colloquially known as the developer's hedge, which is this very hardy. It's actually native green, sort of quite waxy, quite bright green waxy leaf. That's also on my hit list. It's called the developer's hedge because it's just been completely overused. It's hardy and it grows everywhere, so that's definitely on my hit list.
I was going to plant one of those tomorrow. Should I not?
It's frowned upon.
Actually, down south there's a Griselinea Canterbury, which has a smaller leaf that's less waxy, and that's actually really I quite like that. I just specifically have beef with the Griselinea littoralis, and then when it's variegated, don't plant it.
Okay, noted.
But yeah, I think the thing about our native species is they've evolved with the ecology that we've got. So obviously, with no mammals here in New Zealand, we have white things to attract. Which way is it? White things to attract birds, white flowers to attract birds, and blue things to attract lizards or insects.
Oh, really?
So that's sort of why we have we don't have particularly, we have quite a muted colour palette in terms of our flowers. But I'm not opposed to the use of exotics, but I think that the value that you have in terms of improving the ecological value, I think planting should be predominantly native, but the kind of accents of exotics is definitely. I'm not opposed to a cherry either. I quite like a cherry. A ginkgo?
I didn't know that colour thing.
That's fascinating. What?
Yeah, is it yellow for bees as well, or did I just make that up?
Blue. Blue is listed. So there's a Tayeti. I think it's how it's pronounced. If it's wrong, Ben, we're going to have to cut it out. But yeah, what are some plants that I really like at the moment? Euphorbia, that's probably my favourite. You see that quite a lot. It's a coastal plant and it's just very wavy. I like the plants. I mean, maybe it's part of being a Wellingtonian that really move in the wind. So any grasses, we're so lucky in New Zealand. We've got such beautiful carex. There's a conifer. I tend to just know the sort of botanical name, but I put absolutely no energy in my life to the correct pronunciation. So if any landscape architects listening to this, they actually sort of head in their hands at how she pronounces things, because it's not a focus of mine, but it should be. I write them, I don't say them. What are some other plants that I really like? Auckland, actually, I must confess, because they're in a subtropical band, they're just a little bit further north. They have access to a few beautiful trees that we don't quite have down here. And then South Island again. I mean, that's quite interesting, the South Island, because in particular where you are, Sam, in that they have, that real adoption of the deciduous trees, which must make being down at this time of year quite beautiful. It's something that's imported, but it is actually it's quite nice.
Driving through Arrowtown today. Yeah, they're just turning and driving through Arrowtown today. It's hitting that autumn glow. It is pretty stunning. Unfortunately, in Hawea there are only pines. So
wildering.
It's wilding pines and a bit of eucalypt. Surprisingly, I can see out my window, but it's all right.
I just like deciduous trees. I quite like using them in architecture projects. Because like you can have them near a building, and use them for like their inherent qualities of when they lose their leaves or whatever, summer shade and winter light. So that's a pretty epic like temperature moderation tool, which is kind of why we've got them in the courtyard at Mum's house. Because trying to create kind of like a semi-cool zone, so that kind of creates a chimney effect, and then the outsides are hot. So trying to like pull air through. So I think there's such huge toolkit there that I wish I knew more about, that you can really use to like ground and enriching your architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlotte, what is your opinion? This is for the Gerard Dombrowskis of the world. Are you pro architects doing landscape, or do you think it's more of a stick to your lane type of thing? Have you seen a lot of architects kind of shit so much? Because designers in general seem to think that they can design anything. So yeah, what's your opinion on that? I mean, Brad sounds convincing. So.
Well, I think to answer honestly, I wouldn't attempt to design a building, I guess. Well, I guess it's sort of like
you would stay in your lane.
When you get I want this here.
Okay, I'll re-answer this. I think in my experience, and then that comes with working in a big studio and working on big projects, is the more exposure you have to people who are specialists in their field, be it wayfinding specialists, be it an ecologist, be it an architect, the richer the design is, because you as a designer know your lane really well. And although you're trained and you have a sense of things, your skill set only goes so far. And so, for example, a planting list, we can put together a really good planting list, but if an ecologist is to review that planting list, they'll be able to pull that on by such a way, because they just have that technical understanding and skill set that I don't have. Well, I do have, but they're going to be better at it. And I think that's the same for architects. Yes, architects can kind of eke into the world of landscape architects, and some architects are fantastic landscape designers, but we think about things and we approach problems in different ways. And I think the richest projects are ones that involve all of those skill sets.
Yeah, that must be quite hard sometimes as well, because it is a bit of a blurred line, and especially in the residential realm. We've had a bunch of projects where we want to be so involved in how the layout of the landscape or the surrounding context works, just so it is integrated nicely with the actual building itself, that potentially it has in some areas detracted a little bit from if we had a landscape from an earlier time frame.
Charlotte, it was interesting to hear you just talk about wayfinding specialists and ecologists. Are they would you consider them like subsets of landscape architects, or are they separate consultants that you'd also sort of engage with through the landscape design process?
Those are entirely different professions. So depending on the size of projects, wayfinding specialists is an emerging field both within architecture and landscape architects that is just invaluable. You go to an airport and when a wayfinding consultant hasn't been on board, because you're running around blindly trying to find your gate. And then there's other airports you go to and the experience is just completely seamless. Or, when you're navigating through a city and the sign, where do I go next? And then you just look up and there's this sign there. That's when a good wayfinding specialist has been engaged. And you see that in particular, some of the work that's happening in Auckland in central Auckland right now. That's the work of really good wayfinding specialists.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really cool field, but they tend to only work on well, obviously wayfinding by nature is large in size, so that's when you're working on much broader projects. I mean, it's definitely a skill that landscape architects have, but in some cases, it's wayfinding specialists quite often there's a strong integration with graphic design, so they'll also design the signage and things, and so quite often it's a separate piece. Sometimes it's folded into the scope of a landscape architect, but other times it's a separate consultant.
Do we, to go back a little bit to landscape, do you think landscape architects have much of like an aesthetic language? The only one I can think of is Peter Udolf, who's, I think, got a very strong visual language.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's sort of a difficult question. I think there's definitely, similar to architecture in that there are defined styles. But, and an architect who is designing a home in Auckland wouldn't design the same home that they were building in Queenstown, for example. So that there might be some linking elements or linking styles, but that site-specific element is quite different.
That'll be sweet.
What was it, sorry?
They'll just throw some schist on it.
Yeah.
Just a critique of some,
yeah, but I think with landscape architecture potentially more so than architecture, you're working at typically a much larger scale. So the site and the levels of the site, what it's connecting to, the demands on it means that architecture or sort of a design style across one practice is potentially harder to find.
Would you say that you have a design, not necessarily style, but like a design flair or something that you look to integrate in all the work that you do, be it, I don't really know, like a style of seating or a style of ramping or planting or the way you lay something out? Like, is there something that you could draw? Our last discussion was about sort of the lineage of our design and creating like chronology through design development. Would you say that you've created that through your landscape design? Yeah.
I think that's potentially less of a focus for my work. I think what ultimately drives my work is responding to social or environmental issues, and that kind of informs things potentially more so than a specific design language. I think I'm quite happy for the aesthetic in some ways to be quite site specific. I think landscape architecture, although it is inherently beautiful, I think aesthetic is potentially less of a focus than it is in architecture. I think what kind of, functionality and meaning and those responding to kind of social, cultural, environmental stuff governs the outcome more so than an aesthetic drive, I think I would probably say. But there would probably be landscape architects who'd be screaming at this and very much disagree with me. But I sort of think of landscape architecture in that way. It's more of an integration of those other elements than aesthetics.
It's such a big field, being 99% of the earth.
That's not to say it's all designed by landscape architects, though. We're not holding the pen everywhere.
I heard a claim the other day that the Amazon is like 70% designed because they've found like cultivations of species of plants that are like en masse that don't make sense naturally. And so
weren't the Aztecs that the massive cities, the mine?
Yeah. Also, apparently, the population of the Amazon's decreased by something like 30% or 40%. Maybe it's even more than that. But sorry, that's a bit of a digression. But I guess what I'm leaning to is maybe the Earth is all designed. But let's not get into theology. Let's not get into theology.
There's an interesting bit there, though, because I think the cultures that were in the Amazon were real into soil prep. They could get crazy things to grow there in epic ways. Mm-hmm. When I was doing a large commercial project, just the soil prep wasn't really considered in the workflow that well, and definitely something I would spend a lot more attention on next time, partially because the planting all got value engineered out, and I couldn't live with that, so I decided to plant it all
And
myself.
how many did you plant?
You know, it was thousands. It was like four or five ute loads on my ute.
Right.
They're all like fairly small because the budget dropped, so the plant size has dropped.
Sorry, Sam, just to circle back to your point before about design landscapes, I mean, that was certainly the case here in Wellington. You know, there were huge cultivated sites that the tribes, the various iwi were using here prior to colonization. You know, there was massive cultivation fields sort of further south of where Te Aro, where the CBD is. That, you know, there was rich wetlands. It was all kind of cultivated to sustain life here in the city. And a similar stat is a similar example in down in Christchurch, where cabbage trees were used across the plains as a navigation field. So there were, you know, iwis were across New Zealand had very much shaped spaces to, you know, for their sustenance. So we have that history here in New Zealand, and you know, that's a huge part of landscape architecture, is trying to shed light on that and trying to go some way to making that known to the public, because it's definitely, you know, we have that history in New Zealand.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That wayfinding thing's really cool. I think that's fascinating. That is the epitome of a design landscape, really. It'd be interesting to see, you know, to see that maintained somehow on a larger scale, you know, outside of sort of urban projects, and whether that could be integrated into sort of rural environments a little bit more. But yeah, fascinating.
Get to the cabbage trees, gone too far.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But the topsoil thing, Gerard, is also really interesting in that, you know, with large scale greenfield development here, they sort of just rip the top 300 mil of topsoil off, scrape it all back, and then
Start again.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and it's such a, you know, those, you know, I'm not an architect, but those, you know, those concrete slabs that, you know, we build houses on these days, it's not how we used to, you know. Yeah, but from an environmental point of view, the kind of our treatment of topsoil here is very kind of elementary in our understanding of it, and there's you know, there's work going on and there's learning going on, and I'm very much at the first front door of it. But that preservation of topsoil and how it can be more sympathetic in urban development is the next hurdle, both for architects and landscape architects.
There's a great document called Kiss the Earth. I think it's Kiss the Earth or Kiss the Ground. So interesting. So, everyone should watch it because it's absolutely mind-blowing about soil degradation. It's going to have a huge impact on our crops, and potentially less so in this country, significantly noticeable in America. But yeah, its soil is key.
Takes a very low. I think a centimetre of topsoil is grown a year, in terms of the, you know, the creation of the humus layer and how that works. And so, you know, you really have to protect it, and we don't value it enough. But maybe that's kind of the farming side of me, the preservation of topsoil and how special it is. And yeah, my dad spends a lot of time trying to get that just right, to get the crops and the plants humming. It's so critical, and in urban environments we can do much better.
I'll link that Kiss the Ground film in the show notes as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Do you have any landscape architects that you look to for, just for froth or for reference or
for inspiration?
Awesome job. Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe, Sam, to your point of the aesthetics, there was a landscape architect who I was has introduced to his work at university, and I still just think so amazing now. His name's Hong Jiang Yu. He is a Chinese landscape architect who his whole philosophy is this idea of big, beautiful feet. And so basically what he means by that is, you know, in China, historically it was very beautiful to bind the woman's feet, which aesthetically was beautiful but had very poor function. And so his whole idea is that big functional feet are beautiful too. And so to create landscapes that are beautiful and functional, i.e. having that having a production value in terms of land or having a stormwater attenuation value. And I think that really speaks to me, and potentially that's my rural upbringing, but that idea of that we need to create these multifunctional spaces that meet both our needs and the environment's needs.
Beautiful.
You should look at his work. He's amazing. He does.
Yeah,
he does
definitely. That sounds
fantastic stuff.
awesome.
Cool.
Awesome. Oh, well, thanks so much for coming to talk to us today, Charlotte. And I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. I'm sure these guys did as well.
Yeah, I've learned a lot, actually. It's been really insightful. Thank you.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, let's wrap it up there.
Sweet. And as always, thanks to Jacob for the sound, Connor for the drawings, and Ben for the producing. And
I just cut out all my own stuff.
questions. If you have any questions or topic ideas, we would love to hear from you. So feel free to message on the Instagram or our email, which is info@designprinciples.
info@designprinciplespod.com. And just a quick shout out and thank you to the NZIA who have been supporting us over these last couple of weeks. It's nice to have the National Architects Club, for want of a better term, advocating for us. And hopefully they continue to do so. And once again, thank you very much, Charlotte.
Awesome.